Well, thank you for joining us. I always appreciate when you choose to spend your time here with us today. I'm really excited to introduce you to Mr. Paul Vann, and we're going to be talking about high stakes negotiating. We're going to be covering everything from the military, Pentagon, Capitol Hill, and beyond. So, welcome, Paul. I am really excited about this interview.
Understanding that how brilliant you are, Sydney, I am honored to be here. I
See
could
what a
not
great
let that go.
negotiator he is already out there. And for those of you who don't know him, Paul Vann, he's the founder of Wealth Building Academy, which I love that. It's a leadership consultancy based in Maryland near Washington, D.C., where he's done a lot of high profile work. And before becoming an entrepreneur, Paul served over 20 years in the United States Air Force. He served 12 consecutive years in the Pentagon, a year as a Capitol Hill fellow working for a member of Congress in the U.S. House of Representatives. So, needless to say, he's got loads of experience in negotiating in really high stakes settings. And he's also the author of 3 solo books and 3 co authored books. We're going to hear all about that. And Paul, let's jump right in. You have obviously conducted some really high stakes negotiations, but I'd like to take you way back to the beginning if you could remember your very first negotiation.
I tell you, Sydney, thank you so much for that amazing question. And my first negotiation was likely the toughest one, was with my father. And
Yikes.
I'm the oldest son in the family, so that meant my mom spoiled me. And I got to that point, I was working with my parents' grocery store from the age of 10. Even though they were factory workers, I was hired by my father as an unpaid intern.
Okay.
And I worked in our family grocery store after school each day. And so I did that for 5 years. And then I talked to my dad, hey, Dad, I'm kind of running out of time to play on the high school football team. I really wanted to play, and I missed those years of not playing.
Yeah.
And I said, well, Dad, is it okay if I play football and then work in the store after I finish practice or after games? And he said, no.
Oh, geez.
I was looking for the win-win
Yeah.
here. I didn't get the win-win. Dad wanted total domination, and he received it. And so this is what I did, Sydney. I just decided, okay. He said, you're going to have to leave home. I said, okay. So what I did, I went to stay with his mother, my grandmother.
Oh, wow.
I was a smart kid.
Yes,
She
and
was not
ballsy. My
there.
goodness. Yeah.
That was the toughest negotiation I ever had.
Wow.
And I went to stay with my grandmother because she was up there in age anyway. And she said, come on, Paul, I want you to stay with me. And the
Yeah.
first thing she said was, and I want you to play football.
I love this.
And that's what I did.
Oh my
So
gosh.
that was the beginning. I was given I was looking for the win-win, but it
Yeah.
was no, and you got to go.
Oh, I
That's
love
what,
that. Talk about some
yeah.
serious negotiating lessons in there, though. You knew what your BATNA was, that best
Oh,
alternative
yeah.
to a negotiated agreement. I got grandma in my
Absolutely.
back pocket.
That's right. I had leverage.
I love that.
And,
So
and,
good.
and that was win-win.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Now, fast forwarding, I understand that you negotiated in like a foreign embassy or foreign embassies on behalf of the US government. That had to be interesting and involving, I imagine, a fair bit of negotiation. Tell us a little bit about some of your sort of, maybe one of the most interesting negotiation lessons you learned from that experience.
Okay, fantastic, Sydney, and a great question. And at that point, I was a captain in the Air Force, working in the Pentagon, where I always wanted to work. And my leadership, he and I stayed up all night going through the cost estimate.
Yeah.
And it was with the country of the Netherlands, the Dutch embassy.
Okay.
And what happened, we came up with our estimate, and of course, we would have to counter what they came up with. And of course, they're a small country with a smaller budget than ours.
Yeah.
They'll never have a big budget like ours. And what happened, what I discovered through that process was we can both win. They needed training from us.
Yeah.
We were the only country that could provide them with this training. And by the way, it was flight training.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that their high school students go through this training with our college graduates.
Yeah.
That tells you just how great their academic schools are, high schools are.
Wow.
And so from what I learned from that was they were very clever in providing that information to us in terms of our budgets are small. We really cannot afford to pay you all this for this training. But lo and behold, the training still exists to this day.
Wow.
Washington, D.C. offers tours of the embassies every May.
Yeah.
I took my 2 kids there to the Dutch embassy and I met the ambassador. And I
Oh,
just happened to mention the program to her, and she said, "Oh, yeah, that program is still ongoing." I said, "Good."
yeah,
So our work was good, and so we were able to get a contract with them. We're
yeah,
still training their pilots, and they're doing really great as
yeah.
well. So that's one of the great aspects of it.
Oh, and how rewarding. And I love so far already, Paul, that the two areas that we've explored here, your first negotiation and then fast forwarding. Both times you've talked about looking for those wins, which I love. So, as you know, my mission is sharing, I call it the art of feminine negotiation. It's not gender
Right,
based, but the
right,
idea is about not having this really competitive winner take all approach
right.
to negotiations. And if I may, like the military seems to be the poster child, or at least most people's perception of it is for this very masculine competitive style, which may totally not be fair. So I'd love if you could speak to, like, were you the exception to the rule? What's been your experience around negotiating in with
Yeah.
or, for the US military?
Yes, and in fact, that's a wonderful question. And when we look at negotiations, I learned it at a very young age. Once I graduated from college, I was a lieutenant and I was assigned to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio.
Yeah.
And I was in the acquisition field. So I was a cost analyst. So I had to estimate how much a project, a program would cost that we were trying to source. We need parts to go on this aircraft, parts to go on another type of aircraft. And a lot of my leadership were women.
Yeah.
I was fortunate.
Ah,
That's the win-win for me. And they were good at what they did.
yeah.
Whether it was a full colonel, which is almost a step from general, or general officers as well.
Yeah.
So I've had the best of both worlds from that
Yeah.
leadership perspective. But when it came to negotiations, when I was attending or assigned to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, we had what's called the Air Force Institute of Technology, or AFIT, and it
Yeah.
still exists. And you can get a master's degree from there, a doctorate
Wow.
degree, and more. And so they taught us negotiation through the courses that they offered on base.
Yeah.
And that's how I learned it. And when we negotiated these particular contracts, they were in the multi-millions of dollars, and some of them were billions of dollars.
Yeah.
And as an example, we would have 12 contractors vying for this one major contract
Yeah.
and adding subcontractors underneath them who could perform the work. And we have to select one out of 12 contractors.
Wow.
And so we did a lot of negotiating on the cost, price. Can you get
Yeah.
it within the budget, on schedule? Do you have
Yeah.
enough personnel to perform the work? Do you have the data? And then can you actually deliver it?
Yeah.
And that's what happened. That's how I learned. I learned when I was a second lieutenant, brand spanking new to the Air Force.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And for our listeners, I want to put a pin in one of the things that comes up for me there, which is notice all of the factors to consider. I mean, a lot of people go into negotiations with this single focus, just looking at one factor. And just to
Sure,
take a really easy example, I mean, even when we make our purchases, we often
sure.
just look at price. There are
Right.
so many other factors to consider that often get ignored. So I love that.
Yeah.
And Paul, what would you say are the traits or qualities that make for the most effective negotiators in your view?
In my view, we have to look at it as not being a competition,
Yeah,
like you mentioned before. Most people look at negotiations as a competition, but it really isn't. It's about bargaining.
yeah,
It's about negotiating. Let's say if we have an employee, you're going to have really great communication skills.
yeah,
You're going to have some empathy. You're going to have to be persuade. You have to persuade
yeah,
people and influence people.
yeah,
You have to have all of these skills rolled into one. But I think of all of them, you just really have to have some great communication skills. You have to be able to talk one-on-one, and you
yeah,
have to be able to talk to a group as well.
yeah. I love that. And I love that you mentioned empathy because I think that gets forgotten often, right? I mean, and in North America in particular, we come from such a place of ego often. And the best negotiations are, as you say, show up with those be prepared to listen, right? Be prepared to
That's
set your ego aside and try and
yes,
understand the other party. So I think that's beautiful. Now we kind
absolutely.
of dipped our toe in the gender issue, and I was going to sort of
Sure.
dodge the issue, but
Uh-huh.
I can't
Let's
resist
go.
since it came up. And I love that you said that a lot of the leadership you were under were women as well. Like I guess two-part question. Have we seen changes in how women are treated in the military? And if so, how? And also, did you see any changes, any differences, I guess, in terms of negotiating as between the genders?
Well, great question, Sydney. And I would have to say that when we look at the gender aspect and we look at the different aspects of negotiating, women were in many ways better than the men.
Hmm,
And I think
interesting.
in many ways because they did have the empathy, they had more understanding, they understood, in my opinion, had less ego.
Okay,
You know,
interesting.
men come with a lot of ego. I played football
Yeah.
and it was very egotistical game, right? Track and field, which I also participate, isn't so egotistical because it's you and the lane you're in. It's not you and the person beside you.
Yes,
And so when we look at negotiations, I would have to say that the women were much stronger, in
that's
my opinion.
interesting. Okay.
And I believe that when it comes to negotiations, people have to be very understanding.
Mm,
Again, that it's not a competition.
yeah,
Again, that we have to look at a lot of options,
yeah,
alternatives, and you got to. I still go back to you still want both parties to win.
yeah,
Someone
yeah,
had something, for example, we looked at the defense contractors. They had what we needed,
yeah, yeah.
and we had what they needed.
Yeah,
You know, we had the contract,
yeah,
taxpayer monies,
yeah.
and I want to give you just a short example of
Sure.
and I'll go back to the gender issue again. When we look at the pool in which all military branches, when they look to recruit, they looking at the women at this point.
Hmm,
That's the largest pool that they can draw
really?
from because
Wow.
there are less boys and young men that are born. And as a result, they're
Ah,
pulling from the pool. And the women represent 17.2% of all of the military.
wow. Okay, those numbers are changing then. That's
Yeah,
interesting.
they're changing,
Yeah,
absolutely. And when we look at the number of women in leadership, whether it's the military or other,
yeah.
there were more women in leadership positions in 2021 than any other time recorded in the
Wow.
United States.
Okay.
But
That's
only 10% were in Fortune 500,
yes. Yeah.
which needs a lot of improvement.
Yes.
So they're battling against, again, what you said, Sydney, the egos.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
don't believe that women deserve to lead.
Yeah.
But when women lead, it's higher productivity,
Yeah.
more commitment to the organization.
Yeah.
There's also more in terms of workplace stability
Yeah.
because they talk to each other
Yeah.
and they're not trying to dominate.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of great aspects. I have five sisters. I understand this.
Well, it's funny when you talk about that 10%. I think part of that
Yeah,
comes as well from, for so long we've been conditioned to define success based on that more competitive model, which means those so-called feminine traits, and I don't actually think they're gender associated, but
right.
things like empathy and rapport building and listening were actually seen as a weakness for quite some
Yeah,
time, I think. And I love that you take such a different approach. You talk about empathy and collaboration and I love that you talked about options as well
sure.
recently, because I think we
Yes.
get so attached to one outcome that we lose our creativity, which is so important in negotiations. And you must have really seen that on Capitol Hill. I mean,
Oh, yes.
I can't imagine the negotiations that took place there. Tell us about some of the lessons you might have learned in
Okay.
that environment.
I love to. In fact, what happened, I was competitively selected to participate in the Capitol Hill Fellowship Program. As a military officer, I would serve there 10 months, and I worked for a member of Congress in the U.S. House of Representatives. And my job was as a military liaison. So I didn't wear a uniform. I went in with a suit on
Yeah.
every day for that time frame. And I had bills to work on. So I would draft language, give it to a lawyer, give it to an attorney, and they would put it in the legalese that it needed to be to go into the appropriation or
Yeah.
authorization bills. And then I have to get, here's where the negotiation comes in, Sydney. I'd have to work on the other side of the aisle. So I have to go from Democrat side to Republican side,
Oh,
independent.
that
And
is
I'm
a
trying to
negotiation.
get this bill passed. And
Yeah.
so I have to go in and negotiate with them. Okay, do you want to add this in? Do you want to take that out? So we kind
Yeah.
of go through that aspect. But overall, since it was military related, we typically got it. In today's Congress, it would not work. It would not
Interesting.
work
Yeah.
because unfortunately, a lot of legislation isn't being made today on the
Yeah.
House side and the Senate side. The Senate is rolling with it. I mean,
Yeah.
they are doing great. But then when I work for the congressperson themselves for their particular district, I would have to negotiate with the constituents.
Yeah.
I want to give you a great example, Sydney. I want you and the listeners to really take this one in.
Yeah.
So, a certain mayor from a certain city contacted the member of Congress, his representative. Yea, verily, sir, I need your help because my son may get thrown out of the Air Force. He's a
Wow.
fighter pilot.
Yeah.
You know, we love our fighter pilots. That's
Yeah.
where the ego is, right?
Yeah.
They give me the documentation of what happened. And what happened, Sydney, and I'm not going to, of course, call any names, but I'll just say the situation.
Yeah.
He, the captain, was a fighter pilot, and we had a conflict happening out in another part of the world. And
Okay.
his fiance told him, and she happened to be in the military too, if you fly on that mission, I'm not going to marry you.
Oh, jeez.
So what this means is if he doesn't fly, in which we've invested all of this in
Yeah.
him, flying, a multi-million-dollar jet, that's called conscientious objector,
Yeah.
which means if you do not go over and support this mission, you're going to lose your aviation wings.
Wow. High
Now,
stakes.
there's some ways you can avoid that if you have religious reasons
Sure.
or another psychological issue, something
Yeah.
like that. But in his case, it was affair of the heart. And this is, you need a win-win on that one. And so he just decided, no, I'm not going to fly because I love her that much.
Yeah.
And this is a true story.
Yeah. This is great.
And I just told the congressman and I told his constituent, I said, well, unless your son flies, he's going to lose his aviation wing and be thrown
Yeah.
out of the military.
Yeah. Wow.
And he decided not to do it. Now, here's the problem. He did exactly what his fiance wanted him to do.
Yeah.
He didn't fly. And shortly after that, she left him.
I knew that was coming. Oh no, I was thinking, tell me it ain't so.
That's a power negotiation right there, right? And that actually happened.
Oh my
Or,
gosh.
or there were incidents where someone, a military person, was killed on a base in
Yeah.
a foreign country.
Yeah.
And so now you have to negotiate, well, how are we going to make this right? And so not to go into it that much more, but we would have to actually get someone to go over. We have to get a diplomat. We have to recover, the body,
Yeah.
investigation from the military, and then from that country as well. So
Yeah.
it was different negotiations that way. Also with the VA, Veterans Administration,
Yeah.
we had to negotiate to try to get more into the budget or negotiate to get more for the different all services. Since
Yeah.
the member I work for was on the House Armed Services Committee, I would also have negotiated with the Senate Armed Services Committee, and we would also negotiate based on the caucus. So the member I worked for was from the New England caucus, so Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, etc., Maine. And so we would get together, have meetings, and we would go over strategies and how to help that area out.
Yeah.
And then look at it from the rest of the body. We have
Yeah.
435 in the House, and we have 100 in the Senate.
Yeah.
So we have to negotiate all of those, and ultimately we would come up with a bill with the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. I mean, you've got such a wide, expansive range of experience in negotiating, from Capitol Hill to the Pentagon to foreign embassies, you name it. A lot of those would involve, I imagine, dealing with some pretty big personalities. Any tips for our listeners out there on things you would suggest? Like what should you bring to the table? Any tips you have on how to negotiate more effectively when you're dealing with people who have big personalities?
Okay, great question on how people should negotiate is first of all, have an open mind.
Yes. Nice.
Having an open mind because oftentimes when we go into negotiation, one person, one party, and we have two parties going here, think that their position is stronger than the other.
Yeah.
So you want to be able to know who's at the table who's representing you in the negotiation, and there's always someone behind the person that you're
Yeah.
negotiating with. You have to think about them too. So
So
it may
true.
not be the CEO, it'd be the COO or the CFO. You have to think about them as well. And some other aspects for people to look at is, what are you willing to bargain with?
Mhm.
There's a certain aspect. How far are you willing to go? Are you willing to, again, going back to my favorite, it's win-win. Are you willing
Yeah.
to win? Are you willing to just lose? What you're offering, what you need, is going to be a lot different at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
you always have to think about that. What type of leverage can you offer? Then you also want to look at, how are you going to communicate with them over time?
Yeah.
Is it going to be someone that you're going to communicate with on a regular basis? Or is it someone that you see them one time and it's
Yeah.
over?
Yeah.
And then how do you want that agreement to be formed? Is it going to be written in a contract? Is it a handshake deal? Or
Yeah.
is it just verbal? So you
Yeah.
need to have it in writing. In my opinion, you want to have it in writing. And then again, you also have to look at it from the standpoint, how does your position as negotiator different from who sent you out there to negotiate on your
Yeah.
behalf? You
Yeah.
have to look at your boss,
Yeah.
whoever that happens to be, in terms of, are you going to deliver? I'll share just a short story with you for the listeners.
Sure.
It also tied to it. And this one was really interesting. I was a young, I think I was a captain at that time. And I was stationed in Illinois, near
Yeah.
St. Louis at that time. And we had contractors, potential contractors out in California. And I went out with a team of contractors, about 12 of them, and
Yeah.
they were all civilians. And with us, you can't accept anything over $50 if you're in the federal government at that
Okay.
time. And so we go out to the contractor's plant to assess him. We call it cost schedule control systems criteria, is what
Yeah.
we call it. So again, all the acronyms in the
I was going
military.
to say, gotta love those military acronyms.
And so what we had to do, again, we had to look at the budget, look at the schedule. Can they deliver on time? Do you have the right number of people? Will you provide us the data so we can track it? And then in the end, can you actually deliver it? And so we would go through the plant, meet all the people out there, and we would go to a reception in the evening. So I noticed on the second evening, I said, something doesn't look right. So I called my team together and said, hey,
Yeah.
look, we're going to have to be on high alert here. We're not going to accept anything that they try to give us, or do anything that's going to give them leverage
Yeah.
in saying there's a dispute with this contract.
Yeah.
And what was happening, we would go to this reception, they had drinks, hors d'oeuvres, you name it. And then all of a sudden, some real attractive people were coming into the room. And so they were trying to get people paired with other people, right?
Oh,
The
yeah.
government side against the
Yeah.
contractor side.
Yeah.
And I said, time out. We're
Yeah.
having a meeting. We're not going to do that, okay?
Yeah.
And that actually worked against them, Sydney.
Yeah.
And they actually ended up not receiving that contract, and it was worth $3.3 billion.
Wow.
Because of that. They probably would have received it, but once they were trying to do that, what they were trying to do was get leverage to get someone to cross the line, if you will,
Absolutely.
get caught into a situation they shouldn't be in, representing the federal government. And that's what killed it for them.
Yeah. You've got
Yeah.
so much great advice buried in there. And I love that last one. Again, for our listeners there, pay attention in your
Attention.
negotiations, right? Pay attention to the tactics that people are trying to
Yes.
use. Be aware of them, know how to know when to call them out in your negotiations. I love that. And I wanted to really put a pin in for our listeners as well, because Paul
Sure.
mentioned a couple of times the importance in negotiations about knowing whoever you're dealing with across the table or in whatever environment it is, be thinking about who's behind them as well. Who are they? What is their deep why? Who are they reporting back to? That
Exactly.
so often gets forgotten in negotiations, and we end up personalizing it rather than finding those creative solutions that Paul's been talking about. So
Yes.
switching gears for a moment, I know a lot of the work you're doing now as well, Paul, is in like leadership and including in the workplace. And
Yes.
post-COVID, we're hearing such sort of conflicting stories or positions about who holds the power, right? We went from the Great Resignation to the Great Reset to the,
Quiet.
threats of impending
Quitting.
Great Recession. I'd love if you could provide our listeners with, a few key negotiating strategies for post-pandemic workplace.
Oh, excellent question. And I do love that area because when we look at things, I always use the example of a strike, all the strikes we've had this
Yeah,
year. And those were leadership failures on the
yeah,
part of the corporations more than it was the union and
yeah.
the employees.
Yeah. No,
Because you
as a
can't afford,
longtime labor lawyer, I thank you for saying that.
yes, my father was a union president for 20 years. So I
Wow.
actually learned this before I went to my grandmother's house. I'm going to go back there. But yeah, he was a union president, so I kind of learned things from him
Yeah, I
on that
bet.
negotiating side. And he was mostly getting more pay and safer working
Yeah,
conditions was what he
yeah,
was working on.
yeah,
But when we look at it from today's standpoint, we're going to more of that hybrid
yeah,
workplace.
yeah,
And what happened with the pandemic, prior to the pandemic, people wouldn't have thought about working from home, not many people like
yeah.
today.
That's true.
And the virtual space really wasn't there either.
Yeah,
And then for a person in a leadership position, let's say a CEO or even an entrepreneur,
yeah,
having your employees work from home, they're just totally against it.
yeah,
Right? They're totally against. But employees actually have the leverage
yeah,
because they have the skill and they have the expertise that these companies taught them. And what the pandemic did, it separated the wheat from the chaff, if you
yeah,
will, meaning I know I have this information that you all taught me, and I
yeah,
want to do this from home.
yeah,
It cuts down on the commute, it saves people money, and
yeah,
they're actually finding out that a lot of the employees are more productive working
yeah,
from home.
which is interesting.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
very interesting. And so we would never go back to what it used to be. And this also has an impact on the military too,
Yeah.
because
Oh,
people when they were had to take the vaccines, a
yeah,
lot of people didn't want to take it, and they were forced to take it. Our son didn't, and
yeah,
so they sued, and they actually won.
yeah,
So the people that they put out, they have to recover the money and give it back to them. But for today's workplace, I would have to say that we're going to see more and more people that are working from home.
yeah,
And then those who don't work are going to start their own business and contract back and do even better monetarily.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Totally
There,
agree. I
yeah,
love
there's
that.
yeah, there's no going back. And when it comes to negotiations, I think again, it must be a mutuality. They're going to have to
Mm.
both agree that this is the way it's going to be.
Yeah, yeah.
And I didn't try to rhyme that either, but it worked
I
out.
like that. That was, yeah, very clever how you worked that
They're
in
going to
there.
have they're going to have to agree because if you lose all of your employees, you don't have
Yeah.
a business.
No, absolutely. Well, and I
Yeah,
do hope we're going to see a big shift on that with recognizing, having more wellness initiatives and,
absolutely.
and treating people with respect and dignity
That
and
and dignity.
value in the workplace. I love
Right,
that.
and pay them more, pay
Yeah.
women more
Yeah.
what they are worth as
Yeah.
opposed to what you think they should receive.
Yeah.
Here's my thing: women pay should never ever be less than a man.
I know. It's
Never.
yeah.
It's insane.
Yeah, it's still today, it's amazing to me the discrepancy. So
Yeah.
now I want to make sure we give you time to plug your book too. Now you're a
Sure.
two-time number one internationally best-selling author. So tell us about your latest book, Leadership is Influence. Love that title. Why should leaders know how to negotiate? And what's your three-pronged approach to leadership?
Okay, and thank you for asking about my book. Leadership is Influence, and the subtitle is a three-pronged approach to becoming a leader of influence. And I looked at it from the negotiating side. We'll start with that first, is that leader must know how to communicate with their people. They
Yeah.
must be able to talk to them. Employees today, the new employees, let's say if I talk about my two children who are Generation Z, they're different than our
Yeah.
generation.
Yeah.
And oftentimes they don't necessarily communicate with other people.
Yeah.
They're on the phone because
Yeah.
that's what they grew up with.
Yeah.
And so the young people now, what we're finding out from a negotiation standpoint, they don't want to be in a leadership position. They're saying, I'm not interested in that. I just want to make the money and I want to move forward.
That's true.
And so you're different, dealing with a different type of generation. I'll just say
Yeah.
generation.
Yeah,
And
that's
they're
true.
not going to do what their parents did or their grandparents did.
Yeah.
And in terms of the book, I came in with a three-pronged approach because I want more people to understand that they are leaders. Individually, we all have to lead our lives, no matter where we are in the world. We have
Yeah.
to lead our lives. So that point I want it. But when person is in an organization, I want people to understand my three-pronged approach, and that is there's a leader with the title, the
Yeah.
CEO, or the executive vice president, or you have a nonprofit with executive director.
Yeah.
You have a manager who manages the workflow, who works directly for the leader with the title. They're a leader as well,
Yeah.
because without them, between the leader with the title and employee,
Yeah.
you don't have anything. And then there's an employee who is a leader too, but no one has ever told them they're a leader. And the reason why they're a leader, if you have to put together 50 widgets a day, and if
Yeah.
they put together 75 per day, you really need them.
Yeah.
And if the employee goes away, the manager with the title goes away, as well as CEO. The objective is for the CEO to be able to achieve their vision for the company,
Yeah.
their mission, and their goals and expectations. And that can't be done unless the business performance is enhanced. And the
Yeah.
way to enhance this is through leadership by developing the manager and the employees.
Yeah.
And when they're
Oh,
all in sync, they're able to maximize their human potential and increase their revenue.
what a powerful model, Paul. I love that. And I love it is rare to hear people talk about recognizing leadership, including the employees. And you're right. I mean, that's where the morale comes from. That's where that initiative comes from. That's where the teamwork and productivity comes from. I think that's such a beautiful and powerful approach. What's one of the most surprising or, shocking things that you discovered while you were researching, writing your book?
Well, the most powerful thing that I discovered was that a lot of people don't see themselves as a leader.
Yes, that's
But
true.
they actually are. Even if they don't have a title, they're still a leader,
Yeah.
because everyone has to lead their life.
Yeah.
And part of being that leader, and they don't know that they have to make decisions.
Yeah.
The best decision, and a leader needs goals, they need a vision, they need a mission. Everyone has, everyone is a leader,
Yeah.
but people don't know it.
I love
And
it.
so they're walking around and they're thinking, well, I'm not a leader. They don't pay me to be a leader, but you are a leader,
Yeah.
and you
Yeah.
can work your way up to it. And an
Yeah.
influential leader develops other leaders on the staff because they're that confident. They've let
Yeah.
their ego go.
Oh, this is so good. So
Yeah, they,
good. And again, what a call to action for our listeners out there, right?
yeah,
For any of you who are out there listening to this or watching and you're thinking you don't see yourself as a leader, accept Paul's challenge. Find that leadership in yourself, dig and be able to bring it into the workplace. And for those of you who are in managerial or C-suite positions as well, recognize that you're going to get more by setting your ego aside and developing that leadership potential of the people who are working with you. I think it's such a beautiful model.
absolutely,
Yeah, love that.
absolutely.
Now, do you have any non-negotiable habits for yourself that you commit to sort of step into your most powerful self, Paul?
For me, I'm a lifelong learner. And so I find myself, once I learn something, I want to learn more.
Yeah.
I remember one time I wrote my first book, and I was at Bolin Air Force Base in Washington, D.C. And this gentleman was retired. I could tell he was in his 70s. And what he told me was, well, son, congratulations on writing your book, but I don't need to read your book because I'm too old to learn anything
Oh,
else.
gee.
And when he said that, I looked at him, I was like, I hope I never say that,
Yes.
because we're never too old to learn something new.
Yeah.
And my kids, they think I'm crazy because they're like, you thought about this book and you gave it a title and then you wrote the book? I said, I did. So I went from concept, I showed them you can go from concept to getting that first draft out to
Yeah.
work, and then fruition is actually being published.
Yeah.
And to
Yeah.
me, I showed them that because maybe they want to do that one day.
Yeah. What a great role model that is.
Yeah.
And boy, did that strike a chord when you said about people saying that they're too old. I
Oh,
can't
yeah,
tell you how I'm like you. I am in
yeah,
constant growth mindset, right? I mean, it just, what do I, what can I learn today? What can I let myself try and fail at and learn from it? But with my book as well, for Art of Feminine Negotiation,
uh-huh,
so many people have said to me, oh gosh, I wish I had that, 20, 30, 40 years
right,
ago. And it's like, we're still learning and growing and negotiating every day, right? It just
every day.
doesn't make
Every
sense.
day.
Yeah.
Yes. And I had that conversation with my daughter today, and I said, she said, well, what are you going to be talking about? That's a negotiation. And so I gave her some examples of negotiation. I said, you came to me, you said you didn't want any student loans to go to college. I said, that was a negotiation. So it was incumbent upon me to get my laptop out, you get yours out, and we apply for scholarships and grants together.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
now she's in her second year. She's never had any student loans. That's you, a great negotiator.
Oh, congrats. That's awesome. And I love, thank you for bringing it back to that because it's recognizing that all of life is a negotiation, whether you're negotiating with your, I mean, Paul's talked with us here about some really high stakes negotiations and taking a lot of those principles and nuggets that you've learned here today and applying them in your negotiations with your kids, with your intimate partner, with service providers. It's across the
Absolutely.
board. So beautiful. Paul, you've
Yes.
given us so much value here today. I normally like to end by asking, what's one of the greatest mindset shifts that you've had in your life, right? And it doesn't even have to be tied to this subject at all, just
Sure.
an aha moment that has you show up differently.
Well, for me, it actually came in a leadership class, and it came from Admiral Grace Hooper.
Hmm.
She was the person who came up and founded COBOL and the languages for computers.
Wow.
She was a guest speaker in this class, and I'm
Yeah.
sitting there, a young captain, and I'm listening to her. I'm like, wow, man, she's really smart.
Yeah.
And you know what she said? She said, we've been managing people far too long.
Hmm.
We need to start leading people. She said, the bottom line is this, the foundation. We need to manage resources, money, and things, and lead people.
Oh,
And it's in my book. And that's one quote that I will never, ever forget.
I love that.
Compliments of the late Admiral Grace Hooper, who just passed away a few years
Oh,
ago. I'll never forget Admiral Hooper.
I love that. What a powerful, it seems like such a subtle distinction, but what an important distinction. Managing people versus leading, bringing that leadership. I guess.
Yes.
Yeah.
And oftentimes people get confused between management and leadership.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So we
Well, no
manage.
wonder your book is so important. I love that. So where can people learn more about you? Give them a few options of it, remind them about your book title
Sure.
and where they can learn more about you and your book.
Sure. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you for asking. The title, of course, is Leadership is Influence, and it can be purchased or you can find it at www.leadershipisinfluencebook.com, or you can get on Amazon and almost anywhere, Barnes and Noble, Apple Books, Kobo Books, Google
Nice.
Books. You can find it almost everywhere in 66 different countries. So I have it out there. And also on that, my Leadership is Influence book.com website, you'll find out about my leadership development workshops that I provide, in addition to coaching. And I have all of my books out there as well. But I'm just honored to be a guest on your show, Sydney. And Sydney doesn't know this, but I really have admiration for her.
Oh,
She's
thank
brilliant.
you.
Yes, she's brilliant.
Well, I'm right back at you. I love it. And thank you so much for being with us here today, Paul. You've just brought so much value. I'm glad I've got recording so I didn't have to be taking notes as I was trying to concentrate and get it all in. And for our listeners out there, I encourage you to go check out the book. We'll make sure to put all of that information in our show notes. And please do give the gift of sharing. All right. Share this episode with people in your life that you care about. There is so much here. You don't have to be a negotiator for the Pentagon or at Capitol Hill to get value from this episode and from the principles that Paul talks about. And the world is ripe for a shift. And Paul's approach is such a beautiful approach to bringing the world back into balance so that we can all start getting more creative outcomes. So thank you for joining us, Paul. Really appreciated having you here and love this conversation.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you so much, Sydney.
And before we sign off today, just want to share some ways we can work together if you're looking to up-level your negotiation skills. As you may know, I've got everything from online to group to my signature VIP mastermind experiences available to help you better leverage your innate power to get more of what you want and deserve in life. And if that sounds interesting, check out our website at artoffemininenegotiation.com. And if you haven't grabbed a copy of my book yet, please do Art of Feminine Negotiation. They'd be great pair for Leadership is Influence to check out Paul's book as well. And that is a wrap for this episode. So until next time, go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so you can stop missing out and start getting more of what you want and deserve from the boardroom to the bedroom. Until next time, take care.